Okay, good morning. This is the June 18th, 2021 meeting of the Vermont Climate Council Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee. We have our agenda posted on the website and now are also hosting the meeting virtually through Zoom and at a physical location this week at the A&R offices in Montpelier. Our first item is to approve the agenda and our minutes from last week. So does anyone have any questions, comments on either of those items? I know, Ryan, you'd asked add some time for an agenda item. We'll try to kind of bake that into our open discussion or fit it in where it makes sense.
We can also cover it during updates from 5C if there's a bit more time as well.
Okay.
Thanks.
So any other comments or questions on the agenda or minutes of last week? Great. Well, we will consider that all approved. So this week, following Judy's great presentation last week, this week we have a couple of scientists from the Nature Conservancy Vermont chapter and the state of Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department to share some really interesting and relevant work that they've done related to Vermont's forested and connected landscape, its place in the regional context, and how that landscape can be managed to promote resilience into the future. And Bob and Gus are on with us, so why don't you guys feel free to put your cameras on, and I'll hand it over to you. We've got about 40-ish minutes, so use as much of that time as you'd like to present and get into some conversation with the group. And if you would benefit from any introductions from the council subcommittee members, we're happy to do that. So maybe we will do that just for your benefit, since you're new to our group. So I'm Billy Koster. I'm director of planning for A&R and one of the co-chairs of the subcommittee. Abby is the other co-chair. I don't know if she's able to talk right now. There she is. Okay.
Sorry, I'm coming from my car and anyway. Hi. Of course, I'm from the Course Farm Dairy in Whitingham, Vermont, other co-chair. I'll pass it on to somebody else and turn my video off.
Great. How about Ryan?
Still muted. Ryan Patch, Deputy Director of the Water Quality Division at the Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets.
And Alyssa?
Good morning. I'm Alyssa White. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Vermont at the Gund Institute for Environment and UVM Extension.
Judy?
I'm Judy Dow, the Executive Director of Goodwin, a Native organization that works with women and their families throughout New England to self-determine a better life.
John?
Hi, I'm John Roberts. I'm the Executive Director of the Champlain Valley Farmer Coalition, a farmer advocacy group based in Middlebury, Vermont.
And Lauren?
Good morning, Lauren Oates, Climate Policy Manager at the Nature Conservancy, so Gus's colleague.
Great. And then supporting our work is Jane Lazurchek and Pat Field. So if you two could introduce yourselves.
Jane, you first.
Sure. Jane Lazarchuk, Director of the Global Warming Solutions Act. Nice to see you both.
And Patrick Field, CBI Facilitator. And I think David and Jake are here now, maybe.
Okay, yeah, great. David, would you mind introducing yourself?
David Mears, Executive Director of Audubon, Vermont.
And Jake.
Jake Claro, Farm to Plate Director at the Vermont Sustainable Jobs Fund.
Great. And then Charlie Hancock, a consulting forester, is our final member, and hopefully he'll join us at some point. So take it away.
Great. Thanks, Billy. I'm going to try to share my screen, but then Gus is going to lead us off here.
And Bob and Gus, this is Pat, just so we know. Do you want to take questions as we go? Do you want to kind of run through your presentation first? How do you kind of want to handle the back and forth?
I think it might make sense to hold off till the end, just because we've tried to make a complementary presentation, so the odds are that one of us might answer the other's obvious question, and it'd keep us on track to finish up in time.
Great. And how much time do you guys, and I will be your timekeeper. How long do you have to present, do you think, roughly?
We have 40 minutes total for questions and presentations.
Okay, so
presentation and questions.
So presentations, 25 minutes. What do you think?
Yeah, ballparkish.
Okay. We'll keep it on that. We can always adjust. Cool. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. All right. I guess I'll get started then. So good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Gus Goodwin, work at the Nature Conservancy in Vermont. And on behalf of both Bob and I just want to say thanks for the invitation to be here. And, you know, our organizations enjoy a really wonderful partnership. And today is a really kind of special moment to be able to share and collaborate on a shared vision for conservation in Vermont. All right, so next. And as you saw on the agenda, it's actually, next slide, Bob. It's two separate visions, and we were trying to avoid inflicting double vision on anybody. So we want to introduce the concept of binocular vision. So that's with, you know, it's the type of vision that all of us animals enjoy. With two eyes, you get a greater clarity and depth, field of focus, wider field of view. You get depth perception, and as Da Vinci first noted, you even get this greater visibility for seeing objects that are partially hidden by an obstacle. And with all the uncertainty ahead of us, you know, in terms of climate change, the biodiversity crisis, you know, which way society might be headed, I can't think of anything that we need more than clarity, focus, and perspective. So our goal today is to share with you these two bodies of science, each that guide our own work, and attempt to do the job of taking the two separate images and processing and presenting them together as a single vision with greater clarity, focus, and depth. And before, you know, one last caveat is, you know, we're presenting them as separate projects, but I want to highlight that there's been some really nice collaboration along the way. So Nature Conservancy scientists sat on advisory panels during the development of Vermont conservation design, and ecologists from Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife provided really critical feedback and essential feedback, not critical feedback, in the development of the Nature Conservancy science. All right, so next slide. Oh, here are two visions that we're going to try and merge together. And the slide next, please. So starting with the obvious, climate change is happening, and we are seeing species moving in response to increasing temperatures and changes in precipitation. And that in itself is actually, it's a good thing. Nature is a dynamic force, and we have plenty of evidence from the past about species moving and adapting to changing climates. So this slide, you know, taken from pollen records, shows the distribution of 4 important trees during the retreat of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago to about 500 years ago. And the important takeaway here is that, you know, species are able to move and adapt to these conditions, and that there's really, it's a dynamic process. You can see some species simply expanded their range while others marched northwards, and each species is responding to its own preferred climate envelope and habitat conditions. So it's kind of a dynamic force. And of course, there's a very different situation now. We have impediments to dispersal and movement, and we have a biodiversity crisis that's making it for a very different landscape for species to redistribute in, on top of the fact that the rate of change is happening at an unprecedented pace. So next slide. And I want to just highlight, you know, this abundance crisis, because I think it's an important backdrop for all of our work as we're thinking about biodiversity in the future and its relationship with climate change. So across all taxa, we're seeing declines, not just extinction, we're seeing declines in abundance. So even common species are becoming less common. And while this is really sobering news, I want to also pick one highlight to share that I think is important for the group. So the Audubon Society released a really striking report documenting the decline of birds across almost all guilds, all types of species during the last, you know, half a century, with the notable exception of wetland birds. You know, wetland birds have been a focus for a lot of conservation attention. Wetland habitats are highly protected and regulated. And this kind of shows that with a certain amount of focus and commitment, we can reverse the trend and allow nature to thrive even as the climate changes. So next slide. And with that, I want to introduce kind of one of these two roadmaps that we'll be sharing with you today about, where can we make these investments and management decisions to help nature thrive. And the Resilient and Connected Network is the Nature Conservancy's roadmap. And it was really designed around the central question of where are the best places and what lands are most likely to help species adapt to climate impacts and thrive. Next slide. And it has three primary ingredients, resilient systems and species, a permeable landscape, and resilient land. And I want to just talk through these quick in reverse order. So, the biodiversity part is probably intuitive and makes a lot of sense. Along with this kind of permeable landscape, we need critical habitats to be connected to allow species to move and adapt to climate change. And I'm going to focus a little bit more of my time on the resilient landscape piece. One, because it's least intuitive, and two, I think it's kind of additive, and Bob will be covering questions about biodiversity and connectivity as well in his presentation. All right, so next slide. Resilience. So in an ecological context, resilience is broadly defined as the ability to rebound from a disturbance. And in the context of climate change, we specifically mean what are places that can maintain species diversity, productivity, and ecological function as the climate changes. And it really begins with geology. I don't know if anybody got to appreciate the awesome map behind Billy while he was giving the introduction, but it's the bedrock geology map of Vermont, and it's kind of the backdrop for this conversation, literally and figuratively. Yeah, there you go. Nice. So it all begins with geology. The combined influences of bedrock geology and soil type, elevation aspect, all of that's responsible for driving today's biodiversity. And it will be responsible for driving tomorrow's biodiversity as well. And intuitively, this makes a lot of sense. If you think about, we know thick, nutrient-rich soils in a limestone valley are going to support very different species than a thin, acidic soil on a granite hilltop. Our chilly mountaintops are going to have very different species than our warm lake shores. And while each of the species at those sites might change as the climate warms, we can be confident that those enduring features are going to continue to promote biodiversity into the future. So there'll be a wide array of species that are supported by those habitat types. And at the Nature Conservancy, we call this approach conserving the stage. So to take that analogy out, if all the species at a given site are actors in a play, then the actors and even the play itself, those might change over time, but as long as we protect this underlying stage, we can continue to have plays and actors in the future. So at the heart of all of our work is we mapped all these different stages, all the different types of geophysical settings we could, compute out, and we're trying to carry those forward, and they'll be represented in the final design. But species need the opportunity to move in response to climate change. And in the short term, this is going to likely be between short series of movements between microsites and microclimates. So that's the bottom, that area here. So we need microclimates and the ability to move between them. So next slide, please. And if you think about, microclimates, again, these are kind of intuitive concepts. There's places on the landscape most of us can think, where like a cool ravine or a warm south-facing slope that have a lot of climate diversity. And a lot of it is driven by topography. So take this side profile of a mountain. You can see we have latitude, elevation, aspect, cold air drainage through riparian areas, potentially the influence of hydrology, all creating a fairly diverse array of microclimate options, both from a temperature and humidity standpoint. And when you overlay that on a topographically complex, like 3D landscape like Mount Mansfield here, you can see that there are an abundance of microsites and microclimates that might allow species to make a series of short-term movements in response to a warming and changing climate. So next slide. So we mapped, across the continental US, this landscape diversity or microclimates, and then we ran a connectivity analysis to determine, this kind of local measure of connectedness. So if we have a lot of climate options in our microsites, are species allowed, or do they have the ability to move between those? So when you take diversity and connectedness, that yields this map of resilient sites. So next slide. I forgot to mention green is high, brown is low, and that's the same in this map here. So areas that are high, have high resilience, therefore lots of microsites that are connected are shown in green, and areas in brown are low resilience. And you can see Vermont, with its geologic complexity and topographic complexity, actually has a lot of resilient land area in it. So it's a state that's poised well to allow species to move and adapt to a changing climate. But we need to be thinking at a much larger scale because, as this group well knows, the projected climate changes will outstrip the amount of climate variability we have in Vermont. So next slide, please. So this is a animation that I think helps impart that landscape scale view of the importance of, or how species may move and adapt to climate change. And I want to draw your attention to two things. So circled on the right, the Appalachians are an area that's going to support a highly concentrated conduit of species movement in response to climate change, where other places are going to support a kind of more widespread, diffuse flow of movement, and that's kind of embodied by the Great Plains areas. And so while this is a fairly generalized representation of this movement, I think it's a great visual to kind of just draw home the role that our lands are going to play in helping species move and adapt to climate change. So next slide, please. So all of these pieces get baked together to make the RCN. So first is site resilience. We looked at that one in depth. So green is, areas with lots of microsites, climate options for species. Climate flow are those places, shown in blue, are the areas that are going to support kind of landscape scale movement of species in response to climate change. I gave short shrift to biodiversity, but I know Bob is going to be talking about that more in the future, but it kind of goes without saying that you need to be protecting today's sources of diversity to have sources for tomorrow's. And we need to be, managing and protecting species and natural communities and high quality examples of both of those if we want to get to shepherd them through the climate crisis. Lastly, there's the resilient and connected network across the continental US. Next slide. Just zooming into kind of the Vermont level here. So there's a map. But one of the neat things about this analysis is because it's continental in scale is you can start to see where the state hangs in relation to our neighbors. So here's kind of a really important area we call the Blue Ridge to Boreal, which is likely to be a conduit for species movement and adaptation. Next slide. And I'd be remiss to say if this was really good only for nature, it's also really good for people. So the resilient and connected analysis targets the top 23% of the landscape for biodiversity, but that same land base supports 56% of the above ground carbon, 75% of the high value source water, and lots of other benefits as well. So Vermont has something like 44% of the state is captured in the resilient and connected network. So one, that means I think we have an outsized opportunity to protect and shepherd biodiversity through climate change. It also means we have an outsized opportunity to capitalize on all of these incredible co-benefits for the state. And with that, I will turn it over to Bob for the next section.
Hi. Again, my name is Bob Zano. I'm an ecologist with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I wanted to start with the mission of the department because it's really the foundation of the work that I'm going to talk about. And it's a really simple mission. It's the conservation of fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the people of Vermont. That simple mission turns out to have us responsible for something like 24,000 to 43,000 different species in Vermont, most of which we know nothing about. If you look at this pie chart here, vertebrate animals are a very small slice of the pie, and vascular plants are not much bigger. There's thousands and thousands of other species that we know very little about, many of which probably do not have names, and we're responsible for conserving them on the landscape. This is, it's a problem that's been recognized in biology for a long time. There's recognized efforts to deal with this. And one approach that's gained a lot of traction in the scientific literature is this idea of the coarse filter, fine filter approach to conservation. The idea is that We don't have to go out and find each of these thousands and thousands of species. We can use larger or coarser features to conserve species. So if we conserve, for example, an alluvial alder swamp, shown there on the left, we are conserving all sorts of common species like the alder, like some of the herbs that are going to grow there, and then probably also less common species like the wood turtle. Same thing in a black spruce swamp that you might find in the northeastern part of the state. You're conserving black spruce trees, the sphagnum moss, species like spruce grouse, and also this uncommon moss shown here, a moss, sphagnum moss that only grows on herbivore dung. So we don't need to go out and find where every one of those is, but we know if we're conserving these coarser features, we're likely to get those species as well. As Gus did a really nice job of explaining, with climate change, we can't count on species staying where they are and staying in those tight associations. Species are going to be moving. And I wanted to show this image again from this work by Hunter, showing common species moving around the landscape over the past 12,000 years. Beech and hemlock are two species that we often see growing together on the landscape. They're commonly in exactly the same sites. But if you look on the left, the top left part of that figure, beech is in blue, hemlock is in orange. They were growing in totally different sites 12,000 years ago. So we can't be confident that all of our species are just going to march northwards or uphill together as cohesive units. So these coarse filters are probably not going to work in quite the same way in the future. And we need to think about how to address that in any effort to conserve all of Vermont's species. And the way we've realized we can do that is by thinking about coarser filters, thinking a little bit bigger about the way that we are approaching conservation. And that's what led us to Vermont conservation design, which is work that was done by the Fish and Wildlife Department in collaboration with many others, including Forest Parks and Recreation, the Nature Conservancy, Vermont Land Trust, and a whole list of others that I would probably not do justice to if I tried to do it off the top of my head. The idea is that this is a practical scientific vision for sustaining all of those species in a functional landscape for the future. And we tried to do this in a way that uses simple, recognizable features and that is based around thoughtful stewardship and management of Vermont's land. And I'm going to jump right to the map here. This is the map that came out of the work from Vermont Conservation Design. This is all of the coarse filters that we identified overlaid on top of one another. And I'm going to break those down in a moment, but this vision is of an intact, connected, and diverse landscape that represents Vermont's current biodiversity through those coarse filters, and does so in a way that focuses on our best, most intact natural areas and connecting them to each other so that, as Gus was saying, as species are moving, they have the ability to get to the place where they need to be, whether it's an individual animal moving across the landscape or a whole population shifting its range over many decades or even centuries. And actually, I should say just about this map that this is not a map of lands that need to be permanently conserved or turned into state parks. This is a map of ecological function and places where we know that there's high ecological value. And the idea is through any of the conservation tools we have to maintain those functions. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. We've identified, I think, a relatively small set of features at well, it's a 3-scale design and the features are really at 2 scales, landscapes and natural communities. The landscape scale is the big features that are based around forest blocks and riparian areas. And here they are broken down in individual maps. It's interior forest blocks in purple, connectivity blocks in orange, physical landscape diversity blocks in the red, and then surface waters and riparian areas, as well as identifying high priority road crossings where animals and species can move across more developed parts of the landscape. And the idea is to maintain the functions of each element. So here's interior forest blocks. We have a definition for those blocks. We have their functions identified, and then we've mapped out the places where these occur. The best set of forest blocks in each biophysical region around the state, which is why some of these are very large and some are very small. Snake Mountain is a big forest block in the Champlain Valley, But of course, it's tiny compared to what you might find in other regions of the state. Then for each of these features, here again for interior forest blocks, we've come up with some broad guidelines for maintaining those ecological functions. Not detailed forest management guidelines, but broad considerations about how to sustain the function at the scale of the feature. So here it's about maintaining interior forest function, avoiding fragmentation of that feature. So keeping development near the edges of the block rather than having a long road punching into the center of the forest would be a strategy that would maintain interior forest conditions and functions. We then take those features and stack them up, and you start to get a map like this. This is the Burlington to Montpelier area. You can see the forest blocks in green. You start to see how they connect. You can find patterns across the landscape. And then you can see the riparian areas, which include not just the water itself, but the valley bottom that's immediately adjacent to rivers and streams and lakes and ponds. And I said these were recognizable features, and I think that I hope that's intuitive. Like you could walk out of a house and walk across the lawn and step into a forest. And you can think about, well, you can start walking through that forest. And in some cases, it might be only a few hundred feet before you walk out of that forest block and back into some kind of development or other land use. Or there's places in the state where you could walk into that forest and keep walking for many, many miles and still stay in the forest. But at some point you'll come back out and you'll say, okay, there's the edge of the forest block. And riparian areas, I think, are very similar in that we know the places that flood, where water is moving and that are tightly connected to the rivers and lakes and ponds. The next scale of this design is the natural community and habitat scale, where we get more specific. And this is back to those features, like I mentioned at the beginning, like the black spruce swamp. And there's 4 habitat types that we tried to map, well, that we did map across the landscape: natural communities, aquatic habitats, high priority areas, wetlands, and then caves that provide important hibernaculum, which we don't tend to show a map of, just given their sensitivity. I just want to zoom in on natural communities. These are interacting assemblages of organisms, their environments, and the natural processes that affect them. We recognize 97 different types. Even if you haven't thought about natural communities, you probably can recognize, you see something like a cattail marsh or a hemlock forest over and over again across the landscape. They're places that will always support unique biodiversity, even as the climate changes. And I think, as Gus mentioned, you can think about the top of Mount Mansfield with an alpine meadow is always likely to have different species than a red oak northern hardwood forest, or a river cobble shore, or a red maple black gum swamp. They're just different physical settings, different processes, different climates, and in the end, they're going to have different species, even if those species may change over time. We layer those into the design. They're shown here in the dark blue. So we have these broad features, the landscape features with very broad guidelines, and then the natural communities, more specific places, specific habitats where the guidelines for maintaining those functions might be a little more specific, but still lots of conservation options and different ways to achieve maintaining those ecological functions. A final piece of this is habitats that are not permanent across the landscape, but are really important pieces to have, even if they're transitory and shifting over time. These are young and old forests, shrublands, and grasslands, each of which provides habitat for a suite of specific species. And I just wanted to show a link here. As you can see, we did this for species conservation, and but of course there's strong overlap with different climate components. Old forests are very important for carbon storage, and young forests are very important for carbon sequestration. You can see on this diagram that was by Tony D'Amato from UVM and another author, Paul Catanzaro. So those landscape and natural community features occupy a significant portion of the state. It's about 65%. And they provide high confidence that for many, many, many of those thousands of species, we could sustain them in Vermont and into the changing future. There's always going to be some species that design may not meet their needs. Species like the spiny softshell turtle that has very, very small postage stamp sized nesting beaches that are threatened by visitor trampling and predators. And those species will always need specific attention, but the vast majority of species are likely to be have their needs met now and into the future through this design. So here again, I just want to go back to the overall ecologically functional landscape. It's intact, it's connected, and it's diverse. And that's the set of features that we need to maintain ecological function now and into the future. And we can use conservation in all its forms to achieve this. Management, stewardship are the ways we can do this. It's not a plan for land ownership or permanent conservation necessarily. It's a guide to the functions and where we need to be thinking about those across the state. So with that, I want to turn it back over to Gus.
Bob and Gus, it's been about 25 minutes, so maybe 5 minutes more. What do you think?
Sounds good. I'll be quick. I think that at this point, what I would really like to stress is that there's really robust consensus between the approach the Nature Conservancy took and the approach that the Vermont Department of Fish and Wildlife took. And that's, I want to use my remaining time to drive that home. And the differences that you see are really a function of the different questions that motivated each data set. So as Bob was just saying, the mission of Fish and Wildlife is all of Vermont species. So their question was, what is it going to take to maintain an ecologically functional landscape in Vermont? And the Nature Conservancy's piece is motivated by where are the places that are most likely to maintain biodiversity and function in a changing climate. So it's really about where is the end point of that analysis. We have what are all the lands we need and where are some really good places to start. Next slide, please. And so here is the resilient connected network. And I'm just gonna, at the next slide, we'll overlay Vermont conservation design. And then at this point, 89% of the resilient and connected network is contained within the Vermont Conservation Design's highest priority landscapes. If you add in the priority areas next, that's 95% alignment. And the rest is really just edge effects. So again, this is a really robust consensus about which lands are kind of provide the backbone of ecological function in Vermont. And to go back to this binocular vision idea, we have kind of the VCD provides a complete and clear sense of the scale. What are all the lands we need to pay attention to in Vermont? While the RCN provides focus on the places that are most likely to retain biodiversity and function in a changing climate. And together they offer a really nice wide perspective. And for this last piece, I want to just kind of show at a fine scale. So here's an area where we're thinking about investing in protection for wildlife as they're moving across a busy highway. So here's Vermont Conservation Design. Next is the Resilient Connected Network. So a lot of really nice alignment there. And then zooming out even further. So here's Vermont Conservation Design. And then with the next slide, you can add in the Resilient Connected, and you can start to see how these, our actions here in the state of Vermont contribute to our larger scale. And so that's one of the neat things about the two is they provide that nice wide perspective. All right, Bob, back to you.
Yeah, so just to wrap this up, Vermont is something like 80% privately owned. So landowners and what they choose to do with their land are definitely going to be key to success to realizing either of these visions. All of the features are really needed for ecological function. They have different needs for different features, but it's not a buffet where we can pick and choose certain pieces and have confidence that we can sustain species and their habitats into the future. This is really something that unifies many aspects of conservation, combining all of them without necessarily being prescriptive. And it's something that supports Vermont's social and economic values. It helps maintain those parts of it, as Gus was showing. And just to give you an idea, we did this as a science project, but it sustains all of these different pieces of Vermont's landscape that I think are important. And I can speak to Vermont conservation design and some of the uses that this has been incorporated into many different aspects of the Fish and Wildlife Department's work and other work going on around the state, already being used and out there. And I can also say that when I'm using these tools, using Vermont conservation design, I'm looking to the TNC Resilient Network just as frequently to check myself, to see how these fit together, and to look what can be gained from that binocular vision. So these are really visions for the future of Vermont based on what we think is needed to sustain plants and animals into the future. And we can sustain them into the future because we have that intact and connected nature now. We have the opportunity to do that. And it's a choice that we can make, and we have the tools to do that. And so with that, I want to say thank you. And I think we hopefully have time for questions.
Great. Thank you both for that presentation. Very interesting, great visuals, and great context for the work of our subcommittee. So I guess at this point, we just open it up to questions or comments. John.
That was a great presentation. I appreciate that. I was struck mostly by the map of migration of species, and wondered whether you had taken into account the humans who are going to migrate along those same pathways and end up in Vermont. You know, did you take into account, or was that just impossible, the pressure of climate, we'll call them refugees, but people moving north, you know, into Vermont, and the fact that a huge portion of our land is privately owned, and we have an awful lot of land communities that have no planning, no zoning, all these things. So I just wondered if you'd taken any of that into account.
I can start, and I'll try and keep it brief to give Bob a chance to jump in. I will say that we did not specifically include those in ours. We kind of view this as like a map of the biodiversity assets to be part of a planning process that does include, you know, the human dimension. So this isn't, we're not saying it's biodiversity and then like this is the action plan. This is what we should be consulting as we're developing our action plan. And I will say too that, you know, those human dimensions are incredibly hard to predict. I mean, I think I would answer that question so differently 2 years ago before the pandemic and the remote work from home. So I think that, you know, all of these things are ongoing conversations about what are the ecological functions of our lands, and then what are our societal needs for those same lands.
Say that we, like I said, we based it as a science project around what's needed for species in their habitats. But I think as we got into the work, you can see that there's room for people in that landscape. I mean, people are part of the Vermont landscape. And one of the things that I hope that Vermont conservation design can do is help identify where there's room for people in the landscape.
Judy.
Thank you for sharing with us. I also have a question for Gus about the flowchart, and I have a different one for Bob. But so the flowchart is something that shows the path that traditional ecological knowledge has followed, also like and around agriculture and corn. It's the same path. So my question is, how or have you considered how, I'm not sure what they're called, but these people who sit in an office and decide what's invasive and what's not invasive, have you considered how those plants traveling will be considered in our state? Will they be considered as a guest or introduced or considered to be invasive and pulled out?
That's an excellent question, and one that causes a lot of heartburn amongst ecologists. I think that, amongst some, I should say, and then I think that for others, I mean, we are in a position where we may need to just accept the magnitude of the change we're going to experience as the climate changes. And so that idea of, redistribution is a desirable and necessary piece of species survival, I think is foundational to the Nature Conservancy's approach, and I would argue too to the Vermont conservation design. But I think that you've flagged an interesting point that we're at an inflection point about how we decide how to respond to new arrivals and the loss of certain species.
Thank you. And my question for Bob is, you used the term high ecological value. Those were how you determined what was to be mapped. Could you tell me the criteria you used to determine what had high ecological value?
Yeah, so it varied for each one of those features. So for an interior forest block, it's taking into account things like the size of the forest patch, the number of smaller roads and features that are in there, the diversity of features within that block, like the number of wetlands and streams, the number of rare species in that block, taking all of those together and then looking at those on a region by region scale. For something else like natural communities, it's about how well the feature is serving that coarse filter function role, and is it comprised mostly of native species? Has it been largely undisturbed? Is it in a landscape that is connected, intact, and a ranking system that we can use to look at that? I can't go into every one, but we did a similar process for every feature to come up with those that we thought had the highest ecological function.
So there wasn't consideration of fairness to all?
Well, we were basing it solely on the ecological values and not really taking social values into account, because that's the lens that we are tasked with looking at it through. And we think that it's the role of others then to take that work and think broader about it, that it's not our role as scientists to do all of that in one shot. Here's our vision of ecological function, and then what can this help inform?
So that I see where you guys overlap a lot, but that would be a contradiction, correct?
I guess I don't quite understand.
Well, I'm not sure that Gus's answer said the same thing, that they were selecting specific species based on high quality.
Oh, we definitely do have high biodiversity sites included in our analysis.
Mm-hmm.
But the piece I was talking about more is kind of the potential for lands to support species as they move and adapt to climate change.
Right, but you also considered invasives and the fact that they might need to be included in something considered for the future.
Oh, perhaps I misspoke there. I do believe there are certain species that present a real threat to the adaptation and movement of species, and we could call those invasive species. But I think that the context of a changing climate is going to redistribute nearly all of our species, and that we'll need to take a closer look at what we consider to be invasive. So, like, where is that line? But I think that, from our experience managing some of these sites in Vermont, there certainly are species that are detrimental and degrade the ecological function of certain sites.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I know David's had his hand up physically, so we'll go to David, then Jake.
Yeah, physically meaning, is there another way to raise your hand on this?
You can click a little button and it makes a hand pop up on the screen.
Oh, all right. I'll figure that out.
Yeah.
Well, thanks. That was a great presentation. I wanted to share a reflection and comment for your reaction. My reflection is that, in some levels, it feels to me like both of these exercises are capturing the state of Vermont's ecosystems, in somewhat of a snapshot. It's at a moment in time. The systems have changed over the last, thousands of years, and dramatic change in the last period of European settlement. And so it's capturing a moment in time where the landscape has, you know, responded to the most recent trends in land use. And so in that, it doesn't necessarily, it's an interesting opportunity to take this moment, if it's a landscape that we want, and if the ecosystem and ecological function is something that really serves a broader set of values that we all support, then it's a great it's a great framework for setting goals. What it doesn't necessarily do is answer the question of for policymakers about how to find the policies that are most important at this moment. And I think one of the other tools that we need, in addition to this, to address the kind of social questions that you did not address or interlay, is what are the development pressures, which I think are the single greatest threat to these systems. Where's the development happening? Which communities are most at threat? What types of landscapes are most at threat? What parts of the state, what elevations, all those things seem like important data to begin to think about, as well as like, what's the percentage of land that's in private ownership that's not protected by, any restrictions really whatsoever. It's not in current use. It's not conserved. It's not in public ownership. And what are the policies that we need to address those lands that are most at threat? So that's my reflection, and I welcome your comments and reactions to it.
Well, we've done an analysis, and I know this isn't necessarily at the main point you're getting at, but we've looked at those highest priority areas of Vermont conservation design, and roughly a third of them are already in some form of permanent conservation. Another third of them are enrolled in the use value program, and then another third are unconserved private lands. And that's the snapshot of now. Again, I don't think that the goal is necessarily to have that all be permanent conservation, but it's a snapshot of, 2/3 of that is already being presumably well managed to achieve ecological function through those land designations or the UVA program.
Great. And that's certainly, that's, David, an area where we as a subcommittee can engage in some more research and analytics to kind of target our recommendations going forward. Jake.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to echo that. Thanks for all the sort of work that went into the creation of the conservation design, and just the presentation was a really nice, accessible way to understand it and kind of dive into it. I want to go into more detail on my own for sure now. And one of the things that just got me thinking about, and in relation to the subcommittee, is like how easy would it be to overlay kind of some of that land use data onto the conservation design? So like, many of the task groups that I'm working with right now are focused on farmland and forestry, but I work specifically in agriculture and food systems. So I would just be interested to kind of see the alignment of those areas with our farmland. And then the other thing that sort of this got me thinking about, and it's kind of related to David's kind of point about development pressure, is seeing sort of the inverse, is seeing the areas that aren't kind of in the sort of identified as priority areas, and thinking about the policies, that can really reinforce development and kind of human kind of impacts into those areas and away from those identified kind of priority areas. So just trying to think of some other ways of how to utilize this information and data, and sort of what may be accessible to us through, I don't know if there's online, if there's kind of a map that we can kind of do other data overlays on and that kind of thing.
All of the Vermont conservation design data is available on the ANR BioFinder website, and I think Jane put a link to that in the chat. And I think we can also share the GIS data if that's helpful.
Great. Yeah, thank you.
Same with the Nature Conservancy. We have a web map viewer that you can use and interact with as well.
Cool.
Put a link in.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. We're near, oh, Alyssa.
Hey, thanks for sharing. It looks like you've done a lot of work and I really appreciate that. I wonder if you could maybe just step back and from conservation professional perspective, tell us about, I think you had a slide up there, but you went through it kind of fast at the end, what you believe are the most effective programs or policies in Vermont that enable private landowners to participate in conservation on their land.
Well, I'm unmuted, so I'll start and let Bob finish. The current use program, I'd say, is an essential piece of the private lands working landscape. There are a variety of federal and state programs, which I'll let Bob speak to. And then there's something the Nature Conservancy is working on, which would be the Family Forest Carbon Program, which maybe you've heard about. And that's a way for smaller landowners to participate in carbon markets because there's generally a barrier for parcels need to be, well over 1,000 acres to be eligible for that. So we're hoping to lower that and allow smaller landowners to participate. Bob?
Yeah, I'd echo that about the use value program. I think that's probably one of the single most important things we have in Vermont for keeping forest as forest and the reason that we have the landscape we do now. I think the other thing we found, we haven't scaled this to quite the scale that might be ideal in the state, but we've done efforts through UVM students and through some other programs. We have outreach programs to landowners, and just by showing landowners what they have and how it contributes to the landscape, it's been a really powerful way to engage people in thinking about what they want to do and how they want to manage their land. And I was hopeful when those efforts were started, but it's still surprised me how much landowners have responded to seeing how their land fits into that larger context and thinking beyond their boundaries.
Thanks for those answers. Just as a quick follow-up, do you see that there are programs or ideas that are just kind of missing from the suite of tools that are being offered to private landowners that you didn't mention? And to the things that you mentioned that are successful, are they clearly underfunded?
Well, one of the most essential land protection tools, I think, is the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And so that is an area that's got a great track record of dispersing funds, for affordable housing as well as for conservation. And, that's a great mechanism, and they have the ability to disperse of whatever money they get. So I guess that makes them underfunded. Bob, did you want to add to that?
I don't know that I have anything to add. I think all of our conservation programs are really important, and there's probably more we could do with any of them.
Thanks.
All right. Well, thank you all. That was a really kind of relevant and helpful presentation at this point in our process where we're starting to kind of pull together our initial suite of recommendations, and this helps ground us in some good science and regional perspective. So unless there's any other last questions, I think we will say thank you and goodbye to Bob and Gus and move on. All right, well, we may, I hope you're both willing that we may pull you back into our clutches at some point in the future to dive deeper into the work that you've done and how it can inform our work going forward. So thanks again, and we'll see you in the future.
All right, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Great. So we are at the point of our agenda a little bit behind where we've got our first opportunity of 2 for public comment. So if there's any members of the public who would like to take a moment now to share your thoughts, please raise your hands, or otherwise make yourself known. We will have another option later in the day. I see Jennifer and Zach. Okay, well, let's go with the 2 of you for right now. Please take a couple minutes each. Jennifer, you can go first, and Zach.
Thanks, everyone. I really was intrigued with the presentation and glad to see those specific links. I wasn't sure how BioFinder, for example, overlaid, but it in fact is very much a part of what's going on. One of the things I've been thinking about is this outreach to landowners, with 80% of Vermont privately owned. What I don't think has happened is a lens of climate change and how important in the next 10 years, what kind of agricultural practices we use, what kinds of forest practices we use. And I know I'm going to say something now, which I know David will think about and comment on perhaps. But I'm just going to use an example of some land which is in the UVA program. It's 200 acres. And I think there's simply not a climate lens when forest management plans are developed at this point. And the particular management that's going to occur is a series of small clear cuts. And it's just hard for me to imagine throughout this 200 acres that that's going to be the best thing in terms of carbon sequestration or storage. And I don't think we have the data to demonstrate that, but I just feel that it's not. I also feel that it's not perhaps best in terms of water quality, in terms of biodiversity, or in terms of the people who live there. So I think there's more we can do to get fine-tuned, but I think it has to happen in the next 10 years. The same with agricultural practices. What incentives do we have for landowners to do the best that we can in terms of sequestration and storage? And I know there are things out there, but I'm not sure that the people know about that. And if 80% of the land is privately owned, the people need to know that. Thank you.
Thanks, Jennifer. Looks like Graham has joined the group as well. So we'll go to Zach, then Graham.
Thanks. Good morning, everybody. Zach Porter, Lake Champlain Lakekeeper at Conservation Law Foundation. Yeah, that was a fantastic presentation, and not surprised one bit. I've seen Bob and Gus give that before, and they both really know their stuff. I'm grateful to this subcommittee for bringing them in to present. And I wanted to just make a couple of comments or suggestions building on their presentation. You know, Vermont Conservation Design is a fantastic tool. Vermont's lucky to have it. I have full faith that Bob and many others, you know, at our state agencies are using VCD in their day-to-day work. But I think this climate action plan is an opportunity to, in some way, enshrine Vermont Conservation Design's overarching goals. And right now, it is just a nice idea, really. It's not something that Vermont is required to work towards. And the maps may not be the appropriate way to enshrine it. As Bob said, you know, we're not trying to tell landowners what to do with their land. But the percentage goals that Bob referenced as targets for overall management, I think should be something that Vermont is required to work towards. So making sure that we are really making progress towards goals for you know, appropriate percentages of management for various habitat types, you know, across the landscape. And I believe the agencies are already, you know, doing good work trying to achieve VCD's targets, but I think it's really critical for the climate action plan to move that forward in a really substantial way. So you all have a chance as the subcommittee here to push, you know, VCD to make it even, you know, more effective than it currently is. I wanted to also just touch on a couple of things. Alyssa asked a great question about, you know, what are the kind of missing tools here to help us realize the vision of Vermont Conservation Design? And I want to highlight at least two for your consideration. One is, as has already been mentioned, use value appraisal is a fantastic program. It is, you know, one of Vermont's very best tools for conserving both natural and working lands. But it's missing some really critical components. One of those that I'll just highlight here is that unlike every other New England state, Vermont does not allow wildlands to be enrolled in the use value appraisal program. So in the effort of achieving that 9% old forest target that Bob mentioned, we don't have the ability to allow landowners to give them the same opportunity that they would have to manage their lands actively. They aren't permitted to make the decision to manage their lands as wildlands. And this is, I think, honestly, an equitability question, as well as just a matter of sound ecological management. For those people who really want to conserve their forest land, as wildlands, that option is not afforded to them, and they're forced then with the choice of either active management or potentially subdividing their land. And we obviously don't want landowners to be in that kind of decision space. I see Jane made a comment about ESTAs and old forests, but those are only limited to small portions of a landowner's property. And so it's really important, I think, for us to expand what's possible in UVA to really provide a full suite of tools. The other thing that I'll mention here is that our public land statutes don't, I think, allow kind of the full range of options either. And our natural areas that we have here in the state of Vermont are primarily designed to protect, or at least the way that they're used currently is to protect existing, highly functioning natural ecosystems, rather than looking at them as an opportunity to help to restore natural ecosystems over time. And so I think it's really important for this group also to think about public land management statutes and how we could employ, tools to get at the carbon storage goals that we have, creating climate reserves, or to employ kind of more forward-thinking, restoration-focused management regimes on public lands at a broader scale, and really get the most public good possible from our public lands. So those are two kind of very quick overviews of opportunities that I think this subcommittee has before it. And then maybe I'll just mention one last is Tony D'Amato gave a great presentation just recently. If you didn't see it, I highly recommend looking up the presentation he gave on behalf of Forest Parks and Recreation on managing for old forest characteristics. He talked a lot about ecological forestry, which is a really critical part of the forestry field right now, and kind of bringing in a lot of the climate science that we've been talking about. And so in addition to wildlands, how can we make sure that ecological forest management is a bigger part of forest management in Vermont? So just encourage subcommittee members to check out his recent presentation. Thanks.
Thank you. Graham, if you could take a second and share your thoughts, that'd be great.
Yeah, hi folks, this is Graham Unang-Strupnock, the Policy Director at Rural Vermont, and really appreciated those presentations. I love mapping tools, and it's nice to have a few more to go explore more. I think mostly I'll keep it short. I'm trying to sharing a little anecdote. A number of years ago, I went to a presentation on bobcat habitat and migration regionally. And I've been wondering about this throughout this whole conversation. And I think the word that really sticks with me about their conversation is connectivity. Because the way we often deal with folks is sort of one landowner at a time. But if we're thinking about something like bobcat migration, and we see barriers such as long stretches of highways without forest coming to the edges, and it looked like from all the radio collaring that had been done and all the observation that bobcats were really using those forest edges where they came to roads to migrate across the roads in that situation to extend their habitat. And this leads to all sort of implications for biodiversity, for genetic diversity over time, and health of that population, et cetera. And I've just been wondering throughout this whole conversation, if we're going to keep dealing with private farmland and private owners, like where's this coordination? How can we think about things like habitat connectivity on a watershed scale or on a regional scale as a part of this process? And I think this presentation was helpful at sort of bringing that question to bear. And so I'm just thinking about that, and just wanted to put it out there from a sort of a farmer perspective and someone who's been thinking about this for a bit of like, how can we start to connect individual parcels into a greater sort of regional vision, thinking about that type of migration over time, and the specific barriers for specific species as well.
Thanks, Graham. And David, you had put something in the chat that maybe you wanted to share a comment before we moved on, or you good?
I'm going to hold it because I think, you know, between the three commenters, they raised just such a rich array of important issues that I could just go for another hour thinking about how to engage in that conversation. Anyway, but so I'll shut up.
Great, thank you. And I guess just to one of Zach's points, Zach, I'd encourage you to talk to Jane. I know she personally has invested, you know, probably tens of millions of dollars in acquiring marginal lands with the explicit intent of restoring their ecological function. So that's certainly a practice that's common on state land. So I don't know that we need a statutory change to realize that, but appreciate the sentiment. Okay. Moving on to report outs from task leads. We baked a little bit more time into this week, knowing that we're kind of getting nearer to the point when the task groups are going to need to report their initial recommendations to this full group. So as part of your updates, if you all could just kind of speak to how you're doing with that. I think at this point, we're looking to hear from the Ag task group on June 25th and the remaining three groups on July 2nd. So understanding, you know, there's work that needs to be done within the task groups to kind of do the MCA and equity screen and then bring them to the full group for consideration. So just wanted to make sure folks have those deadlines front of mind and could speak to them as they share their updates. And Ryan, I know that you had some stuff you wanted to share, so why don't you kick it off this week?
Sure. Pat, your hand was raised. Did you have something you wanted to jump in with?
Billy named your deadlines, which I wanted you all to hear, so he did. Okay. You're ready to go.
All right, thanks. Always good to keep those deadlines front of mind. Thanks. Met this week. We've started in the weeds. We started deep down in the details, very robust set of spreadsheets trying to account for understanding which practices have the best influence or have potentially negative influence on agricultural emissions and sequestration. We've then moved to understand what local programs, both state and federal, also potentially nonprofit, are available to support adoption of those practices on agricultural cropland. The conversation has, you know, in some ways the deadline is pushing a move towards a synthesis, and in looking to try to organize our thoughts, there's any level of detail that we could recommend, acknowledging that Jane shared, you know, from Maine, some high level principles, but also acknowledging from within the subtask group and then the greater subcommittee, you know, we want to recommend specific actionable programs and strategies, you know, so there's something to the recommendations. And so to kind of start before digging into the details, I wanted to elevate an organizing principle we found useful looking at the cross-sector mitigation strategies template. And that is, if you look in the Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee strategies template, it has the strategy, the primary, task area, but three columns that we thought were useful to consider adding to Ag and Eco and have helped us move towards organizing some higher level recommendations is to include the concept of pathway strategies and then measure and methods. So 3 additional columns in the beginning of the spreadsheet, which allow the 6 high level pathways we've been discussing and considering, and then further being able to expand those with some detail to enumerate the specific strategies that support the implementation of that pathway, for which you can assign any number of measures or methods to implement or quantify beneficial outcomes of those strategies. I could share my screen if I have permission. I do. Let me choose the right screen. And so this is just an example of how for our, oh no, maybe I'm not sharing it yet, sorry. How about now? Are we seeing a spreadsheet?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks. So this is a kind of a modified hybrid of the Ag and Ecosystem Strategy template and adding and reorganizing some of the concepts from the cross-sector mitigation strategies template. And this is just one example of a pathway that's being considered. Again, this is draft and will be shared, of course, when it's time, I guess, next week to make some recommendations. But kind of starting through our evaluation, understanding that there are existing state of Vermont programs that support agricultural greenhouse gas emission reductions. We did some language tweaking, which isn't reflected here, but to enhance, innovate, and adapt these existing programs. And this pathway under it can have any number of strategies. And these are just calling out for large areas of work for which there's any number of specific programs that could be developed or implemented. But existing programs, including the agronomic and grazing practices, methane capture, energy generation. We have a feed management program we're working on, but it needs to be updated and refigured to have a climate component to it, though many of the recommendations could be aligned with regards to water quality. And then, of course, the natural resource conservation, the CRP, the wetland easement, the river corridor, wetland restoration work. It's just an organizing concept we found very useful to, we'll have a high level recommendations. We can break down to strategies. These can be expanded out to reflect any number of level of detail that the group wants to recommend, and then we can establish the measures and methods. So this is a recommendation from the 5C subtask group for the ag and ecosystems. At least for our group, it's helpful to organize the work we've been discussing. The last update or question before the group is the MCA tool and how to integrate that into the process. We may need to look for more time next week if we're going to be recommending strategies on the 25th. We have a homework assignment to begin to work through the MCA tool while looking at the strategy level recommendations. We think the pathway level recommendations are too broad, and we need a bit more detail to run through the MCA tool. And so we're going to endeavor to do that. It's something we were going to come back and discuss next week. Our meeting is Thursday, so a day before the 25th. And I think we could have some strategy recommendations and some pathways prepared to share that may not be able to be fully put through the MCA lens prior to the 25th, is my gut feeling. But we could look for additional time next week. So other members of the subtask group, please jump in, share anything I missed or details that you want to add. That's my roundup. Thanks.
Billy, I think one of the questions Ryan raised is how far each of the task groups needs to be in terms of the MCA and the equity tool screening, kind of, and how we kind of time all that to make sure that happens, and what's doable by end of July and what's not. So
I think that's a great question. My sense is that we probably need to start socializing the various task group recommendations with the full subcommittee on the schedule that we've identified. So I'm comfortable if, you share what you've got in whatever state of kind of review and filtering it is, with the understanding that the task groups can continue to work on that screening, throughout July. I don't know that we have time to kind of hold for that, especially having participated in the equity guiding principles and screening conversation yesterday. I think that's a pretty robust analysis that's being asked of us to complete. And I just don't know that we're going to be able to do all that plus the MCA and then present recommendations to the broader subcommittee kind of on schedule. So I would say all that work can go in parallel, and that, you bring what you can to the larger group on that timeline, just with whatever caveats are necessary. And if others have thoughts on that approach, please share them. But that's my initial reaction.
And Brian, just note in the chat to request that spreadsheet with those new categories. I think all the task groups would benefit from having. So
yeah, the obviously it's a public document, so I'll of course share it. But yeah, the question before the group, I guess, in some ways, is this a useful organizing tool for your own work? And I think this is the manner and form that we're going to try to recommend it to the subcommittee, whatever, the Ag and Eco subcommittee.
Yeah, I know our task group has kind of created similar kind of categories. So I think we're probably all thinking a similar way, and it's just how we name them and use them. So Lauren, you got your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to Ryan and then maybe just jump into the nature-based solutions update, if that works.
Sure.
One, Ryan, this looks really great. We haven't been using the same words within the nature-based solutions task conversation, but even walking through our draft list of strategies, we started bucketing a lot and recognizing themes, and we were talking about creating themes potentially. So themes or pathways, I think pathways is great. So I would also echo Allie's request that you share it, and then we can go ahead and organize our thoughts accordingly. Within nature-based solutions, we have just a bit over 50 strategies, some high level, some very, very specific. I think once we get them into pathways format, it'll be a lot more digestible also. We committed as a group when we met on Tuesday to start working through them on the MCA tool with the hopes that we could at least get through half by our next meeting, and then by the following meeting, complete the rest of them for our initial suite. We hadn't yet seen the equity screen since it was, our meeting was Tuesday and the equity screen conversation was yesterday. So we'll talk next week about how and when to be baking that in. But I look to the other task leads on how and when they intend to. Billy, you just gave us a bit of an idea there on timing. And yeah, I think that might be it for us. I'm feeling good about where we are, but ask anybody else in that group to jump in if they have questions or comments or additions.
Great, thanks, Lauren. Let's see, Abby's not with us. Does anyone else from her group want to give a report out on where you all stand?
I technically am here. I'm just in my car and trying to pick kids up. I'm so sorry.
Oh, it's okay. If you want to do it, then go for it. I just didn't see your little name there.
Well, it's also spelled wrong, so that's not helpful. So we're in a similar place to nature-based solutions. It sounds like Lauren and Charlie and I did a bunch of work after we had met as a task group, whatever the title is, to sort of start to formulate. Again, I was really excited in Ag Emissions yesterday when we were thinking in pathways, because after hearing that, I had the thought that that was going to be a really great organizing principle for task 5E as well. And so I'm hoping that within the next week, we can sort of try to take the process that we already started to try to sort things out and group them into pathways and strategies and sort of solidify that and move forward with that methodology. But I think we're in a good place and starting to really, the strategies and sort of themes and buckets are starting to really come together in ways that I think will be good. So I think we're in a good place. Welcome
Super.
Anybody else's thoughts.
All right. Thanks, Abby. I think the Forest, Natural, and Working Land Task Group, we're maybe a little bit behind everybody. We've been meeting every other week, so not covering quite as much ground, but I think we're in good shape. Allie and Marley have been doing a tremendous amount of work pulling together all of the strategy submissions from the various members. We're kind of north of 70 items at this point. That list may grow a little bit before our meeting on Tuesday of next week, at which point I'm hoping we can have our whole group together to really go through the list, provide critical feedback, and finalize it, and then discuss how and when we're going to apply the various filters. We have broken them out in kind of similar strategy, pathway, implementation step, however you want to name them. So hopefully we can crosswalk that to the framework that Ryan shared, because I think his looked good. And I do agree having somewhat of a uniform approach across the subcommittee makes sense there. So, I think we're not quite as far along as everyone else, but I think we'll be able to deliver something for folks to consume in early July with the understanding that, we'll continue working on it.
Billy, given what was just described, I wonder if, here's a thought, I just want to see what people think for work planning. We can come back to the carbon budget if we need to in a second, is I wonder if next week, because that's the 25th or whatever it is whether, ag and maybe the nature-based solutions can come with, here's our buckets or themes or pathways, and here's our kind of sort of range of strategies. We haven't screened them yet, but kind of here's what we're thinking, and get some initial comment on both those two groups. And then the following week, we could do the kind of access Abby's group and yours, Billy, the land and forest. And we'd at least get the kind of the pathways and recommendations out. And then in the subsequent weeks, we can start, people can coming back with more refined recommendations given the screenings.
I look to Lauren to see if her group feels comfortable doing that, but it's fine with me.
Oh man, well, I won't speak for the whole group. Jake, Judy, and John, jump in if you're feeling otherwise, but I would say we would only be halfway through with the MCA. And not that the conversation couldn't go on without me, but I might not be able to make next week's meeting. So I would like to see that potentially the July meeting, which is what we've been targeting as our.
No problem. I'm also thinking you all may, a lot of you may not be through the MCA for any of those. So my thought is we may be pursuing as kind of the buckets and recommendations, not the screening yet, because you won't be ready. But Lauren, given your time frame, it sounds like it's better for you to go the next meeting. And my only worry there, you'd have one group on next week and we'd have 3 groups the second week, which would just be a lot to cover. That's all.
Yeah, I think, and we've got some folks from UVM lined up to join us next week to talk about their climate assessment tool and some other stuff, which is probably going to take a decent chunk of our meeting. So I think we'd probably have to stick with what we got. We could always go later to a next meeting if 3 the week of the second is going to be too packed.
Just one other question. In terms of the MCA, and then we'll get to the equity tool next, are people clear how to use that tool or which part of the tool to use? Just want to make sure there's some consistency. So are people clear with that and how to use it as you start diving in? Or do you have any questions for Lauren or for Alyssa about it at this point?
I know that our task group is not, at least as a group, kind of engaged with it yet. So I don't know. We may have questions, but I don't know at this point.
Ryan, your group, are you clear with how to use that tool?
Yeah, this is Ryan. Yes, as far as we've walked through it as a group. We're prepared to endeavor to look at our pathways and strategies with that lens. We may have questions and can bring that back to the group next Friday as well about how to apply, and we may have specific questions about a ranking category, but we're willing to give it a go before next week.
And maybe you guys as the first out of the gate can be the guinea pig to come back and say, we try to use the tool, we have these questions, which will help everybody out. So that's great.
Yeah, and I just want to
then directional answer. Sorry, go ahead, Billy.
Well, I was gonna say, I would just like to kind of do a little expectation check with everyone. And I think, absolutely we want to be looking at equity and the MCA analysis kind of early in the process. But I think, notwithstanding our July 26th deadline, we still have a lot of time to work on these strategies. So I think we're going to have the opportunity to come back and run them through these different filters, again in the future. So I think we certainly need to do it now. We need to be mindful now. We need to definitely, take things off that, are negative in those areas, or at least flag that. But this isn't the only time we're going to do this. So I think we need to cut ourselves some slack and just do the best we can with the understanding that we'll have more opportunity to filter in the future. David, and if folks feel strongly otherwise, please let me know. But that's the approach that I'm taking here. So David, your hand's up.
Yeah, thanks, Billy. I wanted to kind of reinforce what you just said with a slightly finer point, which is having taken a run at this a couple of times just to keep trying it out. I find that I end up with as many questions about kind of what are the assumptions that go into each one of these strategies as I do answers. So I think that I'm reaching the conclusion that the benefit of this tool isn't going to be that it provides us with some absolute kind of quantitative outcome, but that it will lift up some important questions that we need to work through as we evaluate each option. And the other thing I've experienced is that it depends, like when you're talking at a very broad pathway level, like should we enhance and innovate in state programs, right? there's no way to get a grasp on what are the equity, and diversity issues engaged in that. It's only when you start getting into finer points and details that starts to play out. So I do think it'll be an iterative process, and we need to be patient with each other.
Great. So just to kind of wrap up our last agenda item on the carbon budget, the consultants on board, A&R had kind of a kickoff meeting with their team earlier this week. I know that there's an effort to schedule a meeting of relevant subcommittee members to talk with the consultant around the carbon budget, I think as soon as next week. So, that's all happening. So, we'll have a better update from that task group probably next week, but the work has begun there, which is good. And then I know, is Iris with us today? Let's see. Iris, you out there? All right, I do not see her. And she's our liaison from Just Transition, so I was going to let her give an update as well. But I think that is a good segue into the discussion around the guiding principles and equity screen presentation. And before we move on, David, is that a new hand up, or is that you're just proud that you found that feature, so you want to keep it?
Yeah, I'll take it down. Thank you.
Cool. So I know that I logged into the Just Transitions presentation yesterday. I know some of you, if not many of you, participated, and hopefully others were able to view it online through the recorded version. And this is really just a time and space for folks who have gone through it to share any observations, ask any questions. I found it interesting and that a great deal of work has gone into it. I also found it a little overwhelming, and have some questions about how, at what level of kind of detail we run our strategies through. I think, I forget the exact terms Ryan used, but there's like the strategy, the pathway, the detail, and I think we'll have to give some thought at which of those levels we actually apply that screening tool, because some of the questions are so specific, we're going to need some pretty detailed implementation pathways to use it on. That's just my general reaction, but otherwise it was great to see the work that went into it. I guess my other observation, and I need to kind of go back through the materials, is that I wonder if some they're baked in there, but some top line kind of aspirational statements or goals might benefit us also. A lot of it is like trying to screen to prevent things from happening. And I wonder if there are some just very basic top line things like Judy's four principles that could really we could also use to guide our work. So, and that may be in there, but those are just my initial thoughts. So curious if others had things they want to share.
Thoughts or comments?
Well, I think I'll agree with Ryan that at least within nature-based solutions, the pathways or themes level is definitely too vague to run the MCA, and I think also the equity tool, which would mean I think we would need to go to the next level of specificity of the strategies. I flagged in the meeting yesterday that there isn't really an opportunity to identify if a policy or program can actually cause harm to any marginalized community, whether it's human or non-human. So I guess we'll see how they respond to that. That was one of the ones that they said they were going to take back to the subcommittee and discuss further. And yeah, Judy's, one of the principles got in there is one of the 4 sustainability principles, but I really like that idea, Billy, that's the high level questions that we should be asking that is not only just a negative impact opportunity, but a positive impact opportunity for the policies and programs we develop.
Other reflect. Judy, did you have a comment?
I do. I'm sorry I couldn't make the viewing. I'll watch it on the link. I had a class, but that's fairness to all living things is exactly why I had those questions this morning to our speakers. If they're predicting this flow of change to come this way, and they're encouraging diversity, how do you control that fairness to all things coming in when there's a God someplace saying, oh, that's invasive, we don't want to hear?
Yeah, I think as Gus was suggesting, that sort of thinking is going to have to shift, right? As things are moving because of nature, you know, what's meant to be where, the whole logic behind that is going to need to be revisited for sure.
Right, because we had that discussion in our subgroup about black locusts. There's this like half-mile, 11th generation colony of black locusts here in Essex. And Bob was adamant that they're not native here, as if it didn't matter. You know, it does matter because it's a colony and it is native to this country. It's just walked north from the Appalachian Trail. So how will plants be treated and animals be treated when that happens if we don't have fairness to all things?
That's a great example, Judy. Thank you.
Any other thoughts on the guiding principles or equity screen presentation? Jane.
Yeah, I thought I'd share my perspective on what I'm thinking about sort of organizationally about their application. You may or may not remember that at the Climate Council meeting, at the last meeting in May, we talked about a three-pronged approach to how we're going to view our equity inclusion work as a council going forward. And we talked about it in the aspect of how we engage with the public around this work. We talked about it from holding space in our Climate Council meetings to revisit this topic every time as a council. And then we talked about it about organization as the council and subcommittees and how we can do better going forward and think about systems in place. As part of that last prong, we reached out to an organization, the Rowan Institute, as a recommendation by one of our consultants as a group to approach with respect to thinking about those organizational components. And they've reacted with a proposal to us in scale and scope that I really believe most folks will agree with me is sort of beyond our capacity right now. But one of the components of that talks about how we apply these guiding principles and equity assessment. And it's something that I'd like to revisit and that we've talked about as a just transition with the co-chairs specifically, but not with the full subcommittee yet, as well as with David Plum at CBI to think about how we take perhaps the component of that proposal and think about it in our application of the guiding principles and equity assessment. And it's something I'm going to bring up with the steering committee of the council next week on an agenda, as well as hopefully bring to the full council for the June meeting. And I think that consistency in application of these principles and ensuring that they're applied across the council consistently makes a lot of sense. And so thinking about perhaps bringing in expert help with that will make a lot of sense. And there's some ideas around how we might do that. So I just want to sort of say that we're thinking about how where and when to plug in with assistance with these and in their application, and it'll be for further discussion. But I think it's really important to think about. So I'm not sure if I answered all of that, but in what I was sharing, but just want to say that there'll be further discussion about how we apply them at different points along the way that hopefully will bring back to the subcommittee in a timely manner.
I was thinking, Jane, too, that I think for this group, being clear in the next 3 weeks or 4 weeks, because maybe at that first level screen, as Billy said, what they actually need to do and do that well and consistently, but have clarity, because I don't think people are clear yet exactly what that is. So.
All right. Any other thoughts on this? You know, again, this will be an iterative thing as we learn more. I think we can dig deeper in each of these things. And as David suggested, you know, at a minimum, they're going to raise good questions for us now as we're refining our recommendations. Okay, well, Jane, we'll look to you in the future for some guidance on that and maybe some assistance, and we'll just kind of do our best in the interim. And at this point, we've got about 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes for any other discussion, chat amongst the group, any topics folks want to raise, anything on folks' mind that they'd like to bring to the subcommittee. All right. Okay, then. I'll try to think of one thing each week just so that I can fill this time in case no one has any ideas, but I didn't do it this week. So we can move ahead looking on to our next meeting next Friday. As I mentioned, we have, and maybe Jane, you can speak to this, but we've lined up Stephen Posner and Chris Kaliba from UVM to present 2 topics from their research. We'll probably do a similar structure as we did this week with the presentations early in the meeting, and then we'll hear from Ryan's task group probably in the second half of the meeting, and that will be the majority of our agenda for next week. But I don't know, Jane, if you want to tease up those presentations right now.
I can't really speak to the soil carbon one, but the Dr. Jillian Galford from UVM will be the one presenting on the climate assessment. And she, you know, the climate assessment has a lot of different chapters and have these policy briefs being decided on and discussed out of each chapter. And she will be presenting on the sort of key chapters related to your work, and especially on the policy brief components and the ideas coming out of that. So I really think it'll be a really rich conversation to inform strategy development for you all. So very timely.
Great. Okay. You know, and then I know we discussed on July 2nd, perhaps hearing from Ryan and Alyssa and possibly Jake on some of the soil carbon work and research they've done and farm to plate. You know, I want to think about that a little bit more with Abby and Pat, given that that's the date we're thinking about having the other task groups present their recommendations. It might be a pretty packed meeting. I definitely want to make sure we have an opportunity to hear from you all on those pieces. So maybe with Pat's help, we can brainstorm scheduling a little bit and get back to you on what the timing of that might be. If not the second, maybe the following week. Okay. So we are ahead of schedule, which is great. Before we move on to public comment, is there anything else subcommittee members would like to raise or discuss at this time? All right, David, I saw it. It's okay.
Just thanks. Just a thing. It's the public comment piece of this is such an interesting component in these meetings because there's really rich comments that are offered and we don't really have discussion about them. But I did want to confirm or affirm or attest to the commenters that those questions are things that are coming up in the task group discussions that I'm part of, and I'm certainly taking notes of those comments, and we'll bring those thoughts. And I think that's true of the other subcommittee members, that we're bringing these comments into our task group discussions. And I don't know that we'll fully address. Some of them are really tough questions, but we'll do our best to address them in the recommendations that we bring forward to the full subcommittee.
Agreed. And my hope is that when we do have those initial recommendations and are available for public digestion, that we'll get some really good written comments back from folks on those that will inform our work further. So thanks for that, David. Okay, so with that, are there folks with us today who would like to share some additional comments, questions, thoughts with the subcommittee? Please raise your digital hand or make yourselves known otherwise. Okay, I think Rob has his hand up, Zach and Graham. So Rob, I wasn't sure if that was a thumbs up or a hands up. So if you'd like to speak.
It is a hands up.
Okay, all right. The floor is yours for the next few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, this is with respect to Ryan's spreadsheet, and also with respect to the 3 scientific studies that I distributed to the group with your assistance, and I appreciate that. The spreadsheet might take into consideration that there are multiple effects from the same measure. That's a principle we call cascade. For example, the three studies that I distributed were about the use of biochar with farm animals and how it reduces emissions and improves animal health. The second one spoke to the fact that Vermont has a great deal of clay in its agricultural soils, and it's about distributing water in both in dry times and in wet times using biochar. And the third was about covering manure lagoons with biochar and the impact that has. Now, that's basically all the same measure, but if we head in that direction, the benefits that we get are more than 3 distinct effects. We get an effect from the avoidance of natural emissions that come from mineralization of natural biomass. In other words, the emissions are lower. Second, we produce sequestered carbon. We improve soil carbon. We sustain microbial activity, and we improve the water that's available to plants in clay soils. We avoid air quality problems, greenhouse gases from enteric emissions, specifically manure emissions, and that will include methane, nitrous oxide, ammonia, et cetera, all very potent greenhouse gases. We also would displace commercial fertilizers and the transportation costs associated with that, the cost to our farmers for buying them. We would greatly reduce nutrient runoff by capturing phosphorus and nitrogen, and we would be producing thermal heat, which would offset fossil fuel costs of heating barns, et cetera. And I just wanted to know, will there be some type of provision in the spreadsheet to show this cascading effect where one measure would impact in so many different ways? That's a question for Ryan.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Ryan, if you feel like responding now, please feel free to. If not, we can follow up with Rob another time.
Yeah, I think following up to that specific question is probably best. However, just saying and trying to understand not only co-benefits, but holistic effects of specific program or strategy recommendations is something we're endeavoring to do, and appreciate the information you're sharing on that topic. And Alex has the Pillis from Agency of Ag has shared in the chat reference to Maine's recommendations as well.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, Zach.
Thanks, Billy. Zach Porter, Conservation Law Foundation. And I just wanted to, because I didn't do this earlier, but Judy's comments, reminded me, that it's really, I think, critical that we make a bridge between last week's presentation, Judy's presentation, and the one that we heard today. And I think we're starting to do that a little bit, but I hope, I guess this is a comment and a question for the subcommittee, but how can we take Judy's excellent presentation on traditional ecological knowledge and merge that with the vision that Vermont Conservation Design presents us? And how can we do a better job of incorporating Indigenous input into land management in Vermont? And there's a lot of questions there, but I hope that those kind of cultural, we can bring those cultural questions in, as well as the ecological ones that we're asking today. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Zach. Okay, and Graham, please share your comment or question with us.
Hey folks, this is Graham from rural Vermont. I think just one question I have, I'm trying to keep the your task forces straight, and maybe just one recommendation is when you all go through them in the future. I know some are better than others about saying what the name of the task force is when you're reporting. So I know there's like a natural solutions and there's ag emissions, but I sort of lose track of some of the titles if they're not presented then. And one of my questions is in relationship to that. So there's the ag emissions task force, but then there's the whole worksheet that Ryan and folks are developing related to co-benefits and sort of a more holistic analysis. And I'm wondering, is that synthesis happening in the ag emissions group, or is the ag emissions sort of taking stuff specifically related to emissions around certain practices or systems, et cetera, and then that will be synthesized with data related to resilience and adaptation and co-benefits by the larger group? I'm just trying to figure out where the homes are for these different things. And if, for example, that greenhouse gas emissions group is sort of looking at that in a vacuum from the co-benefits and in larger sort of holistic perspective, or if that's going to come later. So that's one thing. And yeah, I think that's largely, I look forward to hearing Ryan's group present next week. I think there'll be a lot of robust and great conversation coming from that. And I really appreciate just the visual help that the spreadsheets you all provide, because it's one thing to hear you all speak, but then when Ryan throws that up there, it gives my eyes something to sink into. And I'm holding back from asking a lot of questions because I'm sure I'll learn more next week. But thank you. Oh, and lastly, I want to say about Judy's questions and comments about what are sometimes called invasive, but I think other people call highly successful dispersive plants. David's made comments as well, and Jane, about how these different considerations are made. But I think that's a great conversation to see happening here, and I'm glad it is happening. I know as a clinically trained herbalist that conversations happens a lot in the herbal field as well. And there are a number of great resources from an ecological perspective, but also from a plant medicine perspective, which we could turn you all to consider some different perspectives on that.
Great, thanks, Graham.
Billy, I can talk just to that really quick. So Graham, just a quick response. This is Abby. We are trying to think as holistically as possible in ag emissions, but understanding that the mitigation or the reduction requirements for the ag sector are quite specific, and therefore wanting to make sure that those have been tackled appropriately in that group. And then I did not identify what our task group was specifically, but it is in regards to food access, food systems, and sort of the more of that broader based resilience adaptation approach within the agriculture and working lands and how that ties in. And so it's being synthesized in my head and I'm assuming in lots of others. And so I think that as this starts to bubble up to the subcommittee level, a lot more of that will be addressed. It's just really difficult to capture it in this online format. And for that, I apologize.
Thanks, Abby. Great, yeah, and as we discussed, as the kind of list of initial recommendations and strategies come out of the different task groups, I think it will be there'll be great vehicles for additional public engagement, questions, comments, etc. So that's what we got coming up in the next few weeks. Okay, anything else folks want to raise before we adjourn for today? All right. Thank you very much. Have a great weekend. Happy Juneteenth. And Pat, did you have a comment or were you waving
Nope.
goodbye? Okay. And we'll see you all next week.
Billy, you want to hang on for a second?
Sure.
Thanks.
Yeah, and Jane, if you want to stop recording, that's great.
Thanks all. Gotta jump to another meeting.